The night before Christmas Eve had settled heavily over the old townhouse, pressing against its windows like a held breath. Inside, the drawing-room glowed with lamplight and polite civility, the sort that concealed sharper edges beneath its surface. It was here that Sir Alister Cunningham was last seen alive, seated in his high-backed chair beside the fireplace, a glass of warmed wine resting on the small table at his elbow. By morning he would be dead, and the manner of his death would confound everyone who dared examine it. Sir Alister was a man of habits. He dined at precisely 7, retired to the drawing-room at 8, and rang for his valet at 10 sharp before going upstairs. On this particular night, nothing seemed amiss. His niece chatted briefly with him before withdrawing, the butler cleared the tray, and the servants retired to their quarters. At 10, the bell never rang. At 10:30, concerned but cautious, the butler approached the drawing-room. The door was locked from the inside. It took several minutes, and a growing sense of unease before the door was forced open. Sir Alister sat exactly as he had been left, his head tilted slightly, eyes half-lidded, expression calm, almost serene. The fire had burned low. The wine-glass was empty. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Death had come quietly, politely, as though it had been invited in. The doctor was summoned and confirmed what was already obvious. Sir Alister had been dead for some hours. The cause, however, was not so clear. There were no visible wounds, no scent of gas, no indication of heart failure. Only after a careful examination did the doctor venture a tentative conclusion. Poison. Fast-acting, tasteless, and lethal in small quantities. The word spread quickly through the household, bringing with it fear and suspicion. Poison meant intent. Poison meant planning. And yet, the circumstances made no sense. The wine bottle had been shared earlier in the evening with 2 other guests, neither of whom showed any ill effects. The glass itself bore no residue unusual enough to alarm the chemist who later inspected it. The locked door ruled out any intruder after the butler had cleared the room. Whoever had poisoned Sir Alister must have done so openly, or not at all. Then there was the clue. When the body was moved, a small object was discovered beneath the chair, a silver paper-knife engraved with a floral pattern. It did not belong to Sir Alister. No one in the house claimed it. There was no blood on it, no sign it had been used at all. It lay there like an afterthought, deliberately placed yet utterly pointless. The police seized upon it eagerly, as though grateful for something solid in a case that offered nothing but questions. Interviews followed, all equally unsatisfying. The niece had loved her uncle, or said she had. The butler had served him faithfully for 20 years. The guests had no motive strong enough to kill, and certainly none clever enough to do so without leaving a trace. Each alibi fit neatly into place, leaving no gaps wide enough for suspicion to slip through. The case seemed to mock the investigators with its simplicity. An old man, alone in a locked room, dead of poison, with no clear source and no clear culprit. By the 3rd day, the police were at an impasse. The newspapers had begun to speculate wildly, and whispers of scandal crept into polite society. It was at this moment, when confusion had reached its peak and confidence had ebbed away, that Hercule Poirot arrived. He stood in the drawing-room where Sir Alister had died, his small, immaculate figure at odds with the heavy furniture and sombre mood. His eyes moved slowly, taking in every detail, the position of the chair, the distance to the table, the angle of the door. He asked to see the wine-glass, the bottle, the paper-knife. He listened politely as the inspector explained the locked door, the poison, the lack of suspects. Poirot nodded, murmuring softly to himself. To others, the crime appeared impossible, a perfect mystery sealed by its own logic. To Poirot, it was something else entirely, a puzzle constructed too neatly, with a clue that insisted on being seen. The silver paper-knife lay on the table before him now, catching the lamplight. "An unsolvable crime," he said at last, his voice gentle. "That is what you believe, yes? But I tell you this, when a crime appears either too simple or too clever, it is because someone wishes us to stop thinking. And that, my friends, is when we must think the most. Outside, the night deepened toward midnight, and within the quiet room, the first faint outline of truth began to take shape. Poirot remained standing where he was long after the inspector finished speaking, his gaze drifting not toward the obvious objects of interest, but to the margins of the room, the places where nothing dramatic was supposed to be happening. He asked that no one move anything further, and requested, with impeccable courtesy, that the household assemble once more in the drawing-room. There was no urgency in his manner, yet something about his calm insistence compelled obedience. When they were gathered, he began not with questions but with silence. He watched. The niece sat stiffly, her gloved hands clasped too tightly in her lap. The butler stood erect, eyes forward, expression carefully neutral. One of the guests, a thin man with sharp features, shifted his weight repeatedly, as though uncomfortable in a room that had suddenly become unfamiliar. Poirot noticed it all, filing each detail away without comment. At last, he moved to the small table beside the chair where Sir Alister had died. He measured the distance from table to lips with his fingers, then glanced at the wine bottle, still resting on a sideboard. "You say this bottle was shared," he murmured. "And yet only one man dies. Curious, but not impossible." He lifted the glass, turning it so the lamplight caught the rim. More curious is this: the glass was empty, yes, but not washed. The inspector frowned. "Of course not. We preserved it as evidence. Just so. And yet there is no residue of poison within. That suggests not that there was no poison, but that it was not placed here." He set the glass down gently, as though it might shatter under accusation alone. "So we must ask ourselves, how else might a man drink without drinking?" This remark earned him puzzled looks, which he seemed content to ignore. Instead, he turned his attention to the fire. He knelt, carefully, fastidiously, examining the hearth. The fire burned low, you say, but it was lit earlier in the evening. Someone tended it before retiring? The butler inclined his head. Poirot nodded, then picked up the poker, noting the fine dust clinging to its handle. Handled recently, and by someone who did not care to wipe his hands afterward. He rose and brushed himself off. "Tell me, please, at what hour did Sir Alister take his medicine?" The niece startled. "His medicine?" "Yes, the tonic prescribed for his heart. He took it nightly, did he not?" Poirot's eyes were kind but unyielding. She confirmed that he did, usually just before 10. The bottle, she added, was kept in the small cabinet near the fireplace for convenience. Poirot crossed to the cabinet and opened it. The bottle stood there, unremarkable, its label neat, its stopper firmly in place. He did not open it. He merely weighed it in his hand, then replaced it exactly as he had found it. "Routine," he said softly. "A thing done so often that one cess to think about it, how very useful routine can be." The first flicker of unease passed through the room. The sharp-featured guest cleared his throat, then stopped himself, as though realizing too late that the sound drew attention. Poirot looked at him at once. "You were seated here earlier, yes, near the fire?" The man agreed. Poirot smiled faintly. "You smoke, I believe? A habit you indulged this evening?" "Yes," the man said too quickly, "after dinner. And yet there is no ash here. None at all." Poirot gestured toward the hearth. "Most smokers are not so tidy. Unless, of course, they had reason to be—" The inspector shifted, sensing movement at last, though not yet understanding its direction. Poirot raised a hand gently, as though calming a skittish horse. "I accuse no one," he said. "Not yet. I merely observe that something in this room does not belong to the moment of death, but to the moment before it." He returned to the silver paper knife, lifting it delicately. "This, for example, it is not a weapon, it is not even useful, and yet it demands our attention by being here at all. Why leave a thing so meaningless unless it is meant to distract us from something meaningful?" No one answered. Outside, the clock in the hall chimed the quarter hour, its sound carrying through the house like a reminder that time, once past, could not be recalled. Poirot set the paper knife down and folded his hands. "The deception has begun," he said quietly. "I can see its outline, though not yet its face. But I promise you this, before midnight comes again, we shall know exactly how poison entered a locked room, and why it did not need a locked door at all." Poirot suggested with gentle firmness that each person speak with him alone, not as a formality, but as a courtesy to the truth. The drawing-room, emptied of its uneasy audience, seemed to relax slightly, as though rely. Ved to hold only one voice at a time. The inspector remained nearby, listening, watching, learning, though he did not yet know what lesson was being offered. The niece came first. She spoke calmly, her words carefully chosen, as if rehearsed not in advance, but perfected through repetition in her own mind. She described her uncle's habits once more, his fondness for routine, his reliance on the tonic that kept his heart steady. She insisted she had left him shortly after 9 in good spirits, with no sign of distress. Poirot listened with sympathy, nodding at appropriate moments. Only once did he interrupt. "You say he was in good spirits. And yet earlier you told the inspector he seemed tired." She hesitated, just long enough to be noticed. "Tired, yes, but content. One can be both." "Indeed," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "One can also be anxious and hide it very well." He thanked her and let her go, noting how quickly she left the room, as though eager to escape its scrutiny. The butler followed. His account was precise to the minute, polished by years of service and discipline. He had cleared the tray, checked the fire, locked the door at Sir Alister's request. An unusual detail, he admitted, but not unprecedented. Poirot's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Sir Alister asked you to lock the door himself?" "Yes, sir. Curious," Poirot murmured. "A man alone, wishing for privacy, I understand." "But privacy from whom?" The butler stiffened, then relaxed again, insisting there had been no cause for alarm. Poirot dismissed him with a polite bow, though his eyes lingered on the man's hands, which clenched and unclenched as he departed. Next came the sharp-featured guest. He was eager, too eager, to assist, volunteering details before they were requested. He spoke of the wine, the conversation, the warmth of the fire. He denied touching anything that belonged to Sir Alister and Lau, ged lightly at the suggestion that his smoking habits might matter. Poirot allowed him to talk himself into small corners. "You say you left the drawing-room at 9:30. Yes, and yet the butler recalls seeing you in the corridor closer to 10. The man frowned. "I may have returned briefly. I forgot my gloves." "Of course," Poirot said. "One forgets many things on such evenings." He made a note, though he did not look at it again. The final guest, quieter than the rest, spoke last. She answered questions carefully, sometimes too carefully, as though weighing each word before allowing it to exist. She admitted noticing tension between Sir Alister and his niece earlier in the week, over money perhaps, or the future of the house. Poirot thanked her warmly. As she left, he observed that she avoided looking at the cabinet by the fireplace entirely. When they were gone, Poirot stood alone for a moment, the fragments of their voices overlapping in his mind. Each account fit, and yet did not. Too many details aligned perfectly, too many others brushed past one another without quite touching. Cooperation, he knew, could be as deceptive as silence. He returned to the cabinet and opened it once more, not to examine the bottle but the space around it. The shelf bore a faint ring where the bottle had stood, and beside it a cleaner patch of wood, as though something else had rested there recently and been removed. A spoon, perhaps, or a glass too small to notice in the general confusion. He closed the door gently. Poirot rejoined the inspector. "They all speak," he said, "but not all tell the same story. One remembers too well, another too little. One offers answers before questions are asked. And all of them agree on one thing, that the poison came from the wine. That, my friend, is the greatest contradiction of all." The inspector looked startled. "You believe the W.—Ian was innocent?" "Innocent, yes, and deliberately so." Poirot's eyes gleamed. The poison was taken as medicine, not as indulgence, given at the proper hour in the proper dose, only altered in one crucial respect. A clock chimed again in the hall, marking the slow march toward midnight. Poirot straightened his jacket, his manner suddenly decisive. "Now," he said softly, "we must discover who had reason to turn a habit into a weapon, and who believed themselves clever enough to hide behind the voices of others." Poirot sat in the quiet of the drawing-room, the fire having dwindled to glowing embers. He allowed the room to breathe, the weight of unanswered questions hanging in the air. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, as though nature itself were impatient for the truth to emerge. He closed his eyes briefly and let his mind untangle the threads of motive that clung to the household like cobwebs. Each thread was thin, yet together they formed a dense, almost impenetrable maze. Greed, fear, resentment, desire, all wove a complicated tapestry that could entrap the unwary, but never him. The niece, poised and proper, had more than her fair share of opportunity. She was named in the will as a potential heir, though her inheritance depended on conditions only Sir Alister could dictate. A subtle tension had existed between them for weeks, whispered arguments that servants claimed to overhear, though no one would testify publicly. Could ambition have driven her to exploit a knightly habit, to weaponize medicine against her own uncle? Poirot did not dismiss the thought, but he did not accept it without corroboration. Her careful composure was both a shield and a potential mask. The butler, ever faithful, presented a different enigma. Years of service cultivated trust and discretion, but also intimate knowledge of routines, of secret alcoves, of timing. A man so close to. His employer could act with impunity, or defend with quiet cunning. Poirot considered the poker, the neatness of the fire, the locking of the door at Sir Alister's own request. Could loyalty bend towards self-interest when mixed with fear, resentment, or secret knowledge? Possibly. Yet no clear proof emerged. Only subtle signs, the fleeting twitch of a hand, the almost imperceptible hesitation in speech. The eager guest, sharp-featured and restless, seemed to crave attention and approval, speaking too quickly, answering before questions were fully formed. Such behavior could indicate nervousness or arrogance. He had financial ties to Sir Alister, subtle ones, veiled under the guise of investment and courtesy, but enough to make a loss inconvenient, enough to plant seeds of anger or calculation. Poirot noted the contradiction in his timeline, the discrepancy of his movements near the fire, and the excessive readiness to explain away his smoking habits. Motive of profit, motive of vanity, motive of maintaining reputation. All were plausible but insufficient alone to complete the puzzle. The quiet guest, careful and calculating, moved in shadows, revealing only what she chose. Her proximity to Sir Alister allowed for unnoticed observation, perhaps even influence. She had hinted at family tension and the subject of inheritance, but her words, measured and restrained, betrayed a knowledge that went beyond polite speculation. Was her motive fear? Revenge? Perhaps the exposure of secrets she preferred to remain hidden? Poirot did not yet know. He only knew that the careful layering of truth and omission was deliberate, and that when deception is deliberate, it is never sloppy. As he reviewed the alibis and interconnections, he began to see patterns where none were obvious. Everyone had been present, in some form or another, near the drawing-room at critical hours. Everyone could explain their actions in ways that seemed credible on the surface, yet each explanation carried tiny cracks: the niece's overstated confidence, the butler's habitual neatness, the eager guest's over-precision, the quiet guest's selective memory. It was a network of half-truths, a lattice of small omissions designed to obscure one central act. Poirot imagined the web in his mind, strands crisscrossing, overlapping, each anchored to a suspect, each leading somewhere vital. Then there was the paper knife, seemingly irrelevant, yet strategically placed. It was the perfect misdirection. Its presence invited speculation but concealed the mechanism of the crime, the means by which the poison was delivered without touching wine, glass, or surface. Poirot tapped his chin thoughtfully. The motive maze was tangled, but he began to sense its exit. One thread would pull at the others, revealing a truth both simple and shocking. Greed, fear, jealousy, or desire might explain intent, but only when aligned with opportunity and cunning could the crime achieve perfection. He rose and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened gardens. The wind whispered among the bare branches, the snow glinting faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere among those voices, gestures, and silences, the solution awaited. Poirot's eyes gleamed with the quiet confidence of one who has glimpsed the shape of the puzzle even before all the pieces are in place. The night was deepening, but the threads of deceit, tangled though they were beginning to unravel, and he alone could trace them to their source. The following morning brought a tense excitement to the household. Word had spread quickly that the authorities believed they had solved the crime. A vial, discovered hidden in the servants' pantry, contained traces of the same fast-acting poison that had killed Sir Alister. The eager guest, well, N confronted, faltered, and admitted he had purchased a small quantity weeks before, for experiments in chemistry, he claimed. To the police, the confession seemed irrefutable. They hailed it as a triumph of diligence and instinct. Headlines were already being drafted, praising the swift conclusion to what had been called an unsolvable crime. Relief spread among the household, tempered only by residual sorrow. Poirot, however, remained unmoved. He watched from a quiet corner of the drawing-room as officers congratulated themselves, and the inspector allowed a brief, satisfied smile to curl at the edges of his mouth. The suspect had been taken into custody, and all outward appearances suggested that the mystery had been neatly tied up. Yet Poirot's little grey cells buzzed with unease. Something about the timing, the placement, the ease with which the solution had been reached did not satisfy him. He observed the suspect's behavior, too calm, almost too willing to confess. Even in apparent guilt, there was a subtle detachment that contradicted the impulsiveness typical of an act committed in such cold precision. Returning to the scene of the crime, Poirot examined the drawing-room again, his gaze drifting to the smallest details. The paper-knife still lay in its place, gleaming innocuously under the morning light. The fireplace had been tended, the cabinet dusted, yet the faint ring beside the tonic bottle caught his attention once more. It was a subtle mark, overlooked by everyone but not by him, a hint of a presence, of an object removed deliberately to create confusion. The thought occurred to him that the discovery of the vial might have been exactly what the real culprit had intended, a distraction, a false trail laid with exquisite care. He returned to the assembled household, speaking gently but firmly. "The case may appear solved," he began, his voice carrying throe. "Ugh! The quiet room, yet appearances, as we have seen, are not always reliable. We must ask ourselves whether a confession, no matter how convincing, necessarily reveals the truth. Could a man confess to a crime he did not commit, if persuaded or misled?" The room was silent. Even the inspector, proud of the arrest, could not dismiss the weight of the question. Poirot's attention shifted subtly from person to person. He noticed how the niece's hands twitched, almost imperceptibly, as if she were holding herself back from speaking. The butler's posture, though outwardly composed, betrayed the slightest rigidity at the mention of misdirection. The quiet guest, careful and controlled, smiled faintly at Poirot's remark, a smile that seemed to acknowledge a secret not yet revealed. These were nuances that suggested the true orchestrator of events remained hidden, observing the unfolding drama while the world was distracted by what seemed an obvious solution. He took the silver paper knife in hand once again, turning it slowly, as if weighing not just its physical form, but the intent behind its placement. Its purpose had been misdirection. It was a decoy designed to draw attention to a meaningless object while the method of murder remained invisible to all but the most acute observer. The real criminal had counted on human tendency, to rush to judgment, to embrace convenience over careful reasoning, to overlook subtle signs in favor of dramatic evidence. And so, the vial in the pantry was indeed a crucial piece, but not the key to the puzzle. It was merely a clever echo of a crime already committed. Poirot rose and moved toward the window, his hands clasped behind him. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muted and steady, a world unaware of the shadows within. "A false victory is far more dangerous than no progress at all," he said softly. "The real danger lies in our content, meant with a solution that satisfies but does not explain. Until the threads of motive, opportunity, and timing are truly aligned, the criminal walks free, watching, waiting, and perhaps even smiling at our folly." The inspector frowned, uneasy, yet unable to argue. Poirot's presence alone unsettled the certainty that had taken root. Somewhere within the household, behind carefully maintained composure and measured words, the architect of the crime lingered. They had permitted the authorities a small triumph, allowing the world to believe the mystery resolved, all the while concealing the deeper, more cunning truth. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The game was far from over, and he could feel the pulse of deception yet to reveal itself. Soon, he knew, the final act would arrive, and the true criminal would be forced into the light. Poirot spent the afternoon in quiet reflection, pacing the drawing-room with careful deliberation. The snow outside muffled all sound, creating an almost sacred silence that seemed to heighten his awareness of every small detail: the slight scuff on the polished floor, the faint discoloration at the edge of the fireplace, the ever so slightly warped frame of a portrait above the mantel. It was in such subtleties that truth often hid, and Poirot's little grey cells thrummed with anticipation. As he examined the papers in Sir Alister's study, a faint memory stirred. Years ago, there had been a scandal in another household, a case involving a poisoned tonic and a seemingly loyal servant who had used subtle misdirection to deflect suspicion. It had remained unresolved, buried quietly to avoid social embarrassment. At first, the resemblance seemed tenuous, merely coincidental. But the more Poirot considered the family ties, the servants and the guests now present, the more parallels emerged. There was a pattern, a method repeated with slight variation, adapted to new circumstances. The poison, the timing, the careful placement of an innocuous object to mislead investigators, the echoes of the past had found life again. He returned to the drawing-room where the household moved with a brittle normality, pretending that the day's earlier excitement had settled matters. Poirot asked to speak once more with each of them, though his manner was gentle, almost conversational. He began with the niece, asking casually about her uncle's past acquaintances, mentioning a distant family friend who had died under mysterious circumstances. Her expression flickered, subtle but noticeable, a brief tightening of lips that betrayed more than words could. Poirot filed this detail away carefully, for in human behavior, a reaction is often as informative as confession. The butler, too, revealed more than he intended when asked about Sir Alister's habits. He mentioned, almost inadvertently, a minor disagreement between the family and an old business associate of the deceased, someone who had once been trusted and who had vanished suddenly, leaving behind whispers of betrayal. Poirot's mind worked swiftly, connecting the dots, the seemingly unconnected. Guests were linked not merely by opportunity or motive, but by threads that ran deep into Sir Alister's past, threads long forgotten by those who believed themselves safe. Even the quiet guest could not remain entirely opaque. Poirot, with his gentle insistence, elicited a mention of an old correspondence, letters discovered and hidden years ago that spoke of debts, grudges, and unacknowledged obligations. One letter, in particular, referenced an incident involving a minor poisoning at a distant estate, curiously similar to the method that had now claimed Sir Alister. Poirot's pulse quickened. Here was a connection, subtle and nearly invisible, linking not only method but motive across time. The current crime was an echo of a hidden past, a deliberate recurrence designed to exploit human predictability and complacency. He studied the drawing-room once more. The silver paper knife, the faint ring beside the tonic bottle, the precise angles of chairs and tables, these were not random. They were deliberate gestures, signals to those who could read them, distractions to those who could not, and the suspects, each in their own way, were all caught in a latticework of old relationships and old grievances. One had been wronged, another indebted, another curious about unresolved mysteries, and all had been present when opportunity and circumstance converged. The crime was as much about history as it was about the present, a carefully orchestrated performance built on old secrets resurfacing at a moment of maximum vulnerability. Poirot's eyes glimmered with satisfaction tempered by caution. The solution was no longer merely a matter of logic or observation. It required understanding the hidden motivations embedded in the past, the lingering resentments and half-remembered slights that had finally found expression in lethal form. He could see the outlines of the culprit now, a figure both bold and patient, capable of manipulating not only events, but perception itself. And he knew, with certainty, that the final act, the moment of revelation, was drawing near. The shadows of the past had stepped quietly into the present, and only Poirot could trace their movements before the darkness closed completely. Poirot's mind worked methodically, weighing every observation against his growing understanding of the tangled motives and hidden histories that now clearly intertwined around Sir Alister's death. The earlier arrest of the eager guest had, in Poirot's judgment, been a convenient illusion. He needed a more subtle approach, one that did not rely on the obvious, a method T. Oh, pry open the protective layers of deception each suspect carried so carefully. He called the household together once more, asking only for civility and patience. He placed the silver paper knife in the center of the drawing-room table, not as a focus of investigation this time, but as a prop in a psychological experiment. "We have examined the physical evidence," he began, his voice soft but compelling. Yet, sometimes, the human mind leaves traces that no object can conceal. It is not the poison that tells us the truth, but the reaction to suggestion, the pressure of expectation. He explained that he intended to recreate, in imagination, the moments before Sir Alister's final drink. Each participant would describe in detail what they remembered seeing and doing in the room that evening, but with one subtle twist. He instructed them to include a small imagined variation, a minor act of mischief or curiosity, to see how their own retelling might betray their internal response. Poirot's phrasing was deliberately indirect, suggesting playfulness and observation rather than interrogation. The niece began first, describing her departure from the room, careful to include a detail about glancing at the fire, a harmless addition. She hesitated slightly at the mention of her uncle's tonic, a pause that Poirot noted with keen attention. The butler, precise as ever, added an imagined step of checking the mantelpiece, his voice steady but his fingers tapping ever so slightly against his leg, betraying tension. It was the quiet guest whose reaction broke the careful facade. When asked to include a minor invented detail, she mentioned casually that she had once, years ago, handled her uncle's medicine herself, just to ensure it was properly prepared. Her voice remained composed, but the faintest quiver, the micro-expression across her eyes, the imperceptible stiffening of her POS. Sure, revealed more than her words conveyed. Poirot's eyes lit up with recognition. He let the pause linger, observing carefully. "Ah," he said softly, "how curious. To handle medicine personally is an act of trust, and of access." He circled the table, his movements deliberate and slow, letting each suspect sense the subtle weight of implication without accusation. We see how easily the mind returns to habits and to opportunities. Sometimes the memory itself betrays what the lips attempt to conceal. The quiet guest's composure faltered just enough to give Poirot confirmation. She had claimed no involvement, no access, yet her own imagination had inadvertently revealed a familiarity with a tonic that few could claim. It was an unconventional clue, less a physical artifact than a subtle psychological footprint, a slip in the carefully constructed mask she wore. The reaction alone, the combination of hesitance, micro-expression and instinctive adjustment, provided insight no interrogation could extract. Poirot leaned back, his hands clasped neatly behind him. "We have long searched for evidence in bottles, glasses, and cabinets," he said. "Yet the most telling signs often lie within ourselves. How we imagine, how we embellish, how we respond to suggestion, all of these betray the truth more surely than a careless fingerprint." He glanced around the room, letting his gaze settle on each suspect. "The real culprit, I suspect, has allowed us the comfortable fantasy of an easy solution, but in doing so has revealed, ever so slightly, the thread that will unravel the entire web." The household remained silent, the weight of Poirot's insight settling in like the snow outside. No one spoke, no one moved. He knew the moment had arrived to begin the final tracing of connections, from motive to method, from past grievances to present opportunity. The unconventional clue, subtle, yet undeniable, had illuminated the path forward. And for the first time, the true nature of the crime, the deliberate orchestration of perception and reality, was beginning to emerge in full, stark relief. The criminal's carefully guarded shadow had shifted, and Poirot's eyes followed it unerringly, ready to close the circle before midnight returned once more. The day was waning, and the house felt heavier with tension than ever. Poirot, armed with the insight gained from the unconventional clue, began reviewing the notes he had made, retracing each suspect's words and gestures, each micro-expression and subtle hesitation. He had identified a pattern, a network of connections that seemed to converge upon a single hidden truth. Yet as he prepared to formalize his deductions, an unsettling commotion drew him to the hallway. The butler met him there, breathless and pale. "Monsieur Poirot, the bottle, the tonic from the cabinet, it's gone, disappeared." Poirot's eyebrows rose, but his demeanor remained calm. "Gone? You mean removed after careful preservation? Yes. I left it on the table for inspection. When I returned, it was no longer there. The stopper, even the label, all gone." A chill seemed to sweep through the house. The tonic, the very vehicle of Sir Alister's death, The key to understanding method and motive alike had vanished. The inspector arrived moments later, equally perplexed and frustrated. Officers scoured the rooms, questioned the staff again, but no trace emerged. Poirot moved quietly to the empty space where the bottle had rested, crouching to examine the surface. The faint outline of the bottle remained, dust slightly disturbed, but there were no fingerprints, no indication of forced entry. Poirot straightened slowly, his gaze narrowing. This is no accident. The criminal wishes to bury the truth, to remove any link that might expose them. It is a bold move, but also a revealing one. He considered the suspects. The eager guest, still in custody for the minor chemical purchase, could not have acted. That left the household itself, the niece, the butler, and the quiet guest. Each had opportunity, each had motive in the tangled web Poirot had begun to unravel. The removal of the bottle, executed with care, indicated someone familiar with the layout of the house, someone confident in their control over time and movement. Poirot called the three suspects into the drawing room, his calm authority contrasting with the tension coiling in the air. "Someone among us," he said softly, "has taken what was crucial to understanding a crime already committed. Let us examine our reactions. Not words, but reactions. Therein lies a guide, more truthful than any statement offered under duress." The niece appeared composed, but Poirot noticed the smallest twitch of her fingers, the almost imperceptible shift of weight from one foot to the other. The butler's face was calm, yet his lips pressed together ever so slightly, as if holding back irritation or fear. The quiet guest, her posture unchanged, blinked with a fraction more frequency, a subtle disruption in her normally measured cadence. Poirot let the silence linger, then walked deliberately to the empty shelf. "The act of removing evidence," he said, turning to face them all, "is both defensive and aggressive. Defensive because it conceals action, aggressive because it presumes no one will notice. And yet we have noticed. The hands that moved the tonic are those accustomed to trust, accustomed to observation, and accustomed to the illusion of invisibility." The quiet guest's gaze flickered, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement that Poirot had drawn closer to the truth than anyone had anticipated. She made no move to speak, but the tiniest intake of breath betrayed her. Poirot's keen eyes recorded every micro-signal, the turn of a head, the subtle stiffening of a shoulder, the slight hesitation before she lowered her gaze. He turned to the inspector. "The criminal now acts with desperation. They have altered the evidence, in hopes of redirecting our attention, of preserving the lie. And yet, in acting so, they have revealed themselves as bold, calculating, and near to revealing their own weakness. The vanishing of the tonic is not a defeat. It is an illumination." The household seemed to hold its collective breath. The game had escalated. The stakes had risen. Trust had become a fragile and fleeting thing, shattered by the audacity of the theft. And within this fracture, Poirot could see the outline of the final moves, the timing, the manipulation, and the inevitable unmasking of the individual who had believed themselves untouchable. He glanced at the quiet guest once more, his eyes unblinking. "Soon, the shadow that conceals the truth will be drawn aside," he murmured, almost to himself, "and the criminal will realize that even the most careful removal of evidence cannot hide the path laid bare by human behavior and the inexorable logic of deduction." Outside, the snow continued to fall, the world still and silent. Inside, the tension coiled tighter, and Poirot knew that the resolution, the confrontation with the true orchestrator of deceit, was now unavoidable. The game had shifted. The vanishing evidence had only sharpened the pursuit. The house was steeped in an uneasy quiet when the evening shadows began to lengthen, the fire casting flickering shapes along the walls. Poirot, seated near the mantelpiece, reviewed the tangled web of motive, opportunity, and past grievances. He felt the weight of the vanishing tonic, but also the faint pulse of an approaching revelation. The household moved cautiously, each person keenly aware that the balance of suspicion had shifted, though none could yet see where it pointed. A sudden sharp cry shattered the fragile calm. It came from the corridor near the study. Poirot leapt to his feet, moving swiftly, the inspector at his heels. They found the sharp-featured guest sprawled across the floor, his face pale, a small cut on his temple, his hand pressed to a nearly empty vial of a mysterious liquid. The shock in his eyes was genuine, yet Poirot noted immediately that the vial was not the tonic. It contained a faintly sweet but lethal poison, clearly intended as a threat or worse. "Attempted poisoning," Poirot said quietly, his voice steady, though his mind raced. "The criminal is not finished. They wish to intimidate, to mislead, to continue their work under cover of fear." The inspector bent over the man, checking his pulse, his expression tight with alarm. "He will recover. But the message is clear. We are being watched, challenged, perhaps even hunted." Poirot turned his gaze to the assembled household, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. "It seems," he said calmly, "that the threads of our previous inquiry are not sufficient. The criminal operates with boldness, exploiting what they know of human reaction and of our assumptions. A second act, more audacious than the first, proves that the danger is immediate, and that they are several steps ahead." The quiet guest, standing near the doorway, attempted to appear composed, yet Poirot observed the imperceptible tension in her shoulders, the slight twitch of her fingers. He did not speak immediately, choosing instead to allow the room to settle, letting the implications of the attempted murder sink in. "Notice, my friends," he continued, "the choice of target. It is not random. It is calculated, meant to provoke a response, to test our readiness, and to obscure the true focus of the crime. The perpetrator desires us to believe that this event resolves or clarifies the situation, when in fact it deepens the mystery." Poirot examined the vial carefully, noting its unusual design. It had been placed deliberately where it could be discovered, yet not consumed. A warning, or a challenge. He could not yet be certain. "The criminal understands both chemistry and psychology," he murmured, turning the vial in his gloved hand. "They have mastered the art of suggestion, of creating fear without immediate consequence, and in doing so, they control the tempo of our investigation." The inspector looked exasperated. "But why risk a second attack? Surely the first murder should have satisfied them." Poirot shook his head. But we must consider motive carefully. The first death alone could not achieve their objective. The vanishing evidence, the misdirection, the attempted harm, it all serves a larger plan, one designed to protect themselves while drawing attention elsewhere. The criminal wishes to obscure the truth with spectacle, to make us chase shadows while they remain hidden. He stepped closer to the quiet guest, his gaze unwavering. "And let us not overlook human nature. Those who commit such acts are often bold, but also precise. Each action is deliberate. The timing, the targets, the threats, they are all calculated to manipulate. The attempt on the gentleman's life is not merely a continuation of the crime, it is a statement, a test. And in this test, the smallest slip can betray the architect." The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the wind outside rattling the shutters in eerie accompaniment. Poirot, undisturbed by the chaos, felt the gears of the final revelation beginning to turn. He knew that the next hours would be decisive. The criminal was still ahead, but their confidence and reliance on deception had left faint traces that only a mind trained in the most meticulous observation could follow. "The game has shifted," Poirot said softly, almost to himself, yet loud enough for all to hear. "We no longer merely seek to explain a past act. We must anticipate the next. The shadow that has walked among us, hiding in plain sight, has now provoked its pursuers, and in provoking, they have left the smallest, most delicate thread, one that I shall follow to its inevitable conclusion." The household remained silent, the tension almost tangible. Poirot's eyes glimmered with quiet determination. The villain had struck again, but for the first time their steps were traceable, their strategy imperfect. The final act was approaching, and Poirot was ready to confront it. Poirot returned to the drawing-room alone, allowing the household to recover from the shock of the second incident. The wind outside rattled the shutters, as if impatient for the truth to emerge. He moved deliberately around the room, eyes sweeping over every detail. The positions of chairs, the arrangement of objects on the mantel, the faint impressions on the carpet. Each item, each gesture, each overlooked habit was a potential clue. As he examined the cabinet where the tonic had been kept, His attention lingered on the faint ring beside the empty space. He had noticed it before, dismissed it as a minor trace, but now, in light of the attempted poisoning, it returned to his mind with new significance. The ring was slightly off-center, as though the bottle had been handled not by routine, but in a deliberate, calculated way. He tapped his finger lightly on the polished surface, letting his mind replay the sequence of events. Then he recalled a small, almost trivial detail from the earlier questioning, the niece's offhand comment about how her uncle had always insisted on checking the labels of any medicine he took, even briefly, before consuming it. She had said it casually, as if irrelevant. But Poirot now saw it differently. The habit, seemingly innocuous, explained why the real poison could never have been delivered through the tonic at its usual position. The murderer had to find a moment when her uncle would trust a medicine that appeared ordinary, yet contained a lethal twist, an act that required both timing and insight into the victim's habits. Poirot's gaze shifted to the paper knife on the table. It had been placed there deliberately, a minor distraction, yet it now appeared to him as part of a pattern of misdirection. Every object, every comment, every gesture had been carefully orchestrated to guide the investigators toward false conclusions. The criminal had counted on the human desire for simple explanations, on the willingness to seize the first plausible thread. And yet, in doing so, they had left subtle, nearly imperceptible markers. He walked slowly to the window, eyes fixed on the courtyard. It was then that another detail crystallized, the quiet guest's habit of lingering in particular spaces at precise times, of moving with careful deliberation, of avoiding certain areas altogether. Each movement had been recorded, seemingly unimportant, but in retrospect it revealed a rhythm, a pattern of access, observation and subtle manipulation. The placement of objects, the timing of the niece's departure, the slight adjustment of the cabinet shelf, all of these were synchronized with her movements. Poirot's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. "Ah, mon Dieu," he murmured. "The pattern has been visible all along, hidden not in grand gestures, but in the minutiae of behavior." He returned to the mantelpiece, picking up a candlestick and holding it in his hands. The faint scratches on its base, unnoticed before, now spoke clearly. A minor adjustment, an invisible trace left by fingers that had touched it with purpose. Each object, each habit, each small gesture was part of a carefully woven tapestry that revealed the killer's presence, not by bold action, but by the consistency of subtle deception. He moved to the center of the room, letting the pattern form in his mind like a precise map. The first murder had followed a path of opportunity and knowledge of habits. The vanishing tonic had been a calculated attempt to mislead. The attempted poisoning had been a deliberate test of reaction. And through it all, the criminal's behavior left a trace in the alignment of objects, the timing of actions, and the unspoken rhythms of daily routine. Poirot's gaze settled once more on the quiet guest. Every subtle gesture, every controlled expression, every carefully chosen word now fit into the emerging pattern. The truth, once obscured by misdirection and assumption, lay fully in view. The criminal had relied on patience, observation, and knowledge of human nature to execute the perfect deception. But no deception is flawless. The minutiae, the patterns invisible to the inattentive eye, had now revealed the architect of the crime. With deliberate calm, Poirot addressed the inspector. "We have followed threads that appeared minor, dismissed remarks that seemed trivial, and now, at last, the pattern emerges. The truth has been in plain sight from the beginning, hidden within habit, movement, and subtle gestures. The criminal has acted with cunning, but they cannot escape the consequences of their own consistency." He allowed a pause, letting the weight of his observation settle over the room. The shadows outside lengthened, yet inside, a clarity had begun to take hold. The final confrontation was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a certainty, guided by the pattern that only a mind attuned to the smallest detail could discern. The game was nearing its conclusion, and the criminal's carefully constructed illusion was about to be undone. Poirot gathered the household once more, insisting that all remain in the drawing-room. The air was thick with tension, the earlier shock of attempted poisoning still lingering, yet now tinged with anticipation. The storm outside had intensified, wind lashing against the windows and snow swirling in the court yard, as though nature itself conspired to heighten the drama. Poirot stood with his hands folded neatly, his small, precise movements radiating calm authority. "My friends," he began, "we have traced the steps of a crime not merely clever, but deeply personal. We have seen misdirection, vanishing evidence, and subtle manipulation. But we have now reached that most important moment, the understanding of motive. And I assure you, it is far more complex than mere greed or resentment." He turned slowly to the quiet guest, whose composure had seemed almost unnatural throughout the investigation. "You have been careful, yes, too careful at times. Every gesture, every choice, every hesitation has been deliberate. And yet, no human can suppress the truth entirely. Even the most controlled mask will slip when it conceals not just action, but desire." Poirot's eyes, sharp and unwavering, studied her in detail. "The first murder, that of Sir Alister, seemed at first a question of opportunity, of convenience. But the pattern, once observed, reveals something deeper. It was not merely the inheritance, nor the petty slights of family discord, that drove you. It was the obsession with control itself. To orchestrate the deaths, the deceptions, and even the test of our responses is to assert dominion over not only events, but over the very perception of others. You could not tolerate imperfection, disorder, or the possibility of surprise. Each act was a means of imposing your own exacting order upon a world that resisted it." A faint murmur rippled through the room. The niece's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. The butler shifted nervously, and even the inspector straightened, sensing the gravity of Poirot's insight. "You see," Poirot continued, "the criminal mind is sometimes guided not by necessity, not by profit, but by the compulsion to shape reality itself. You knew Sir Alister's habits, of his expectations, and of the predictable behaviors of everyone in this house. You used them, manipulated them, and created an environment where events would unfold precisely as you desired. The poison, the vanished tonic, the distraction of the paper knife, the attempted intimidation, they were not ends in themselves, but instruments in a performance that only you could conduct." The quiet guest's eyes flickered, a shadow passing over the controlled mask. Poirot noticed the slightest hesitation in her breath, the micro-expression of recognition that she had been seen beyond her careful veneer. "You sought perfection," he said softly, "not merely in the act, but in its concealment. And yet perfection is fragile. A single gesture, a small misstep, a subtle reaction, these have betrayed you, revealing a truth that no misdirection could fully obscure." He moved toward the mantelpiece, glancing once more at the faint ring where the tonic had been kept. The hidden motive is thus laid bare. It was not money, nor inheritance alone. It was the assertion of control over life, over chance, over the responses of others. To you, the household, the investigators, and even the memory of Sir Alister were elements in a tableau to be arranged exactly as you pleased. And yet, as always, the human mind is incapable of absolute concealment. The pattern emerged, subtle yet undeniable, and the truth cannot be avoided. Poirot paused, letting the weight of his revelation settle over the room. Outside, the wind moaned, and the snow pressed against the windows, but inside, the silence was nearly absolute. Even the criminals seemed momentarily suspended, caught in the clarity of exposure. "The extremity of your actions," Poirot said finally, "was not born of necessity, but of compulsion. And compulsion, my dear, is a motive as powerful and as dangerous as any that can be bought or imagined. You acted with precision, with patience, and with an exacting demand for obedience from chance itself. Yet all that cunning could not outpace the inevitability of observation and reason. The truth, as always, finds a way to emerge." The quiet guest's composure cracked at last. She inhaled sharply, a slight tremor in her hands, as the realization of exposure settled fully upon her. Poirot's eyes, calm but unwavering, met hers with the quiet authority of one who had seen every detail, traced every action, and understood the deepest impulses behind them. The motive, shocking in its depth and precision, had been revealed. The desire for control, the obsession with shaping events perfectly, had driven her to extremes that defied expectation, and yet, in the end, had betrayed her. Poirot moved deliberately to the centre of the drawing-room, his small frame radiating a quiet authority that seemed to still the very air. The storm outside had grown into a furious gale, wind lashing at the windows and rattling the shutters, yet inside the room, all eyes were fixed on him, sensing that the moment of revelation had arrived. He glanced around, meeting each gaze with calm precision, before letting his eyes rest finally on the quiet guest, who had remained silent, her composure now a fragile mask stretched taut over fear and anticipation. "Mon ami," Poirot said softly, "we have traced the crime from its first subtle act to the most recent attempted subterfuge. We have observed patterns, noted inconsistencies, and read the quiet signals that escape the casual observer. The web you have woven is intricate, yes, but not impervious. It is time, at last, to untangle it fully." He gestured subtly, drawing attention to the empty space where the tonic bottle had once rested, the faint ring on the polished surface serving as an invisible pointer. "You removed the bottle." "Yes, but in doing so, you revealed more than you intended. You assumed our attention would be diverted, that the obvious solution would suffice. Yet the subtle traces, gestures, habits, micro-reactions, have guided us directly to you." The quiet guest's lips pressed together tightly, her eyes narrowing in a flash of defiance, but Poirot continued, undisturbed. "The attempt on the other guest's life," he said, "was calculated, designed to sow fear and misdirection. You believed this second act would obscure the first. And yet, you underestimated the power of observation, of reasoning, of subtle pattern recognition. The trap was always in place, built not with physical barriers, but with the logic of consequence and the inevitability of truth." Poirot's voice softened, almost conversational, as though inviting confession rather than demanding it. "You have acted with precision, with patience, and with the meticulous care of one obsessed with control. Every step you took, every minor manipulation, every gesture intended to mislead, has only confirmed the pattern we have been tracing. You have been bold, yes, but boldness, when coupled with human fallibility, is never perfect." For a moment, the room held its collective breath. The quiet guest shifted, her hands clenching involuntarily, and Poirot's keen eyes caught the slight twitch of a finger, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. "You see, madame," he said gently, "we are not merely observers of crime. We are observers of character, and it is character that betrays intent. You cannot fully suppress what lies within. And so, even in your most controlled moments, the truth has found its way." The guest's composure fractured slightly. She opened her mouth, perhaps to deny, to argue, to attempt one final deception, but Poirot anticipated the hesitation. "It is unnecessary," he continued, "to resist. The evidence not merely in objects or in confessions, but in the inevitability of human behavior. You sought to impose order, to manipulate events, and to control perception. That, madame, is why you acted. And that, ultimately, is why your plan has been revealed." A flash of desperation crossed her face, a fleeting thought of escape, of one last reckless act. Poirot's eyes followed it calmly, noting the almost imperceptible shift in balance, the faint instinctive movement toward the door. But the inspector, discreetly positioned, blocked any possibility of flight. The criminal was cornered, and Poirot's composure never wavered. At last, with a tremor in her voice that betrayed both fear and resignation, the quiet guest spoke. Her words fragmented at first, then steadier as she realized resistance was futile. Yes, it was me," she admitted. I couldn't allow disorder. Everything had to be perfect." Her confession trembled on the edge of mania, yet it was genuine, an unmasking not of deceit, but of the inner compulsion that had driven her to murder, misdirection, and manipulation. Poirot nodded gently, allowing a small, satisfied smile. "And so, the puzzle is complete. The motive, the method, the misdirection, all aligned at last. The criminal has been unmasked, and the threads of deception unraveled. The storm outside began to abate, leaving a stillness in its wake. The household exhaled collectively, relief mingling with lingering shock, while Poirot remained at the center of the room, calm, composed, and resolute. Every piece had fallen into place, every pattern revealed, And the perpetrator's obsessive desire for control, the hidden heart of the crime, had been exposed. At last, the case of Sir Alister's murder and the chaos it had unleashed was resolved. The room had begun to relax, the tension dissolving in the wake of the quiet guest's confession. The inspector had moved forward to formally take her into custody, the household collectively letting out a breath they had been holding for days. The storm outside had faded, leaving only a cold, still hush, as if the world itself paused to acknowledge the resolution. Poirot remained standing near the fireplace, calm and contemplative, his gaze sweeping over the faces of all present, and yet, beneath his calm exterior, a faint unease stirred. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, tugged at the edge of his mind. He recalled the pattern, the sequence of actions, the traces left by behavior, but one detail had never fully aligned: the initial discovery of the vial in the pantry and the eagerness of the arrested guest to confess. At the time, Poirot had dismissed it as a convenient misdirection, a symptom of human nervousness under suspicion. Now, as the household relaxed, that faint dissonance returned, sharper than before. Poirot asked to see the records of purchases, correspondence, and movements once again. The inspector, still flush with relief from the confession, complied eagerly, though with a hint of impatience. Poirot's eyes scanned the pages carefully, noting the dates, the times, the patterns of correspondence between the household and external contacts. And then, almost like a whisper of insight, he noticed it, a series of letters, overlooked in the commotion, addressed to the butler, written months before the murder, discussing chemical substances, timings, and even the precise placement of certain household items. A chill passed through Poirot. He turned slowly toward the butler, who met his gaze with a polite, practiced neutrality. "Monsieur," Poirot began softly, "you have been the most constant presence in this household, observant, loyal, and yet one can observe too much. One can manipulate without detection if one has patience and knowledge of habits." The room froze. The inspector stepped forward instinctively, confusion etched across his face. The butler's composure faltered, just slightly, but it was enough. Poirot advanced with gentle precision, placing the letters on the table. "Here are your communications," he said, fingers lightly touching the pages. "All the subtle planning, the knowledge of each habit, each movement, each micro-reaction. You instructed, you guided, you manipulated, and in doing so, you shaped events in such a way that another could be blamed, that a confession could be secured without the risk falling upon yourself." The quiet guest, now pale and trembling, looked on in shock, understanding dawning in terror. The butler's eyes, calm and steady until now, flickered with the faintest shadow of irritation. He remained silent, but Poirot's keen observation noted the imperceptible tightening of the jaw, the slight shift of weight, the subtle hesitation before any denial could form. "You see, Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "the confession, the apparent unraveling of the criminal, was itself a carefully orchestrated act. The true mastermind worked in the shadows, directing, manipulating, observing every reaction, every small slip. And the final twist, so often it is hidden in the most reliable, seemingly loyal presence. The most devoted servant is sometimes the most dangerous, precisely because no one suspects them." The butler's silence was telling, but he attempted a final, desperate maneuver, an almost imperceptible step toward the door. Poirot's eyes did not waver. "It is unnecessary, monsieur," he said with quiet authority. "Every movement has been noted, every pattern observed. Escape is impossible. Your attempt to orchestrate from the shadows has failed because even the most careful manipulation cannot alter the truth, the inevitability of observation, and the pattern discerned by patient reasoning." The butler's shoulders sagged slightly, the mask of control finally slipping. The household watched in stunned silence as Poirot laid bare the reality. The quiet guest, driven by obsession with order and perfection, had been a pawn, carefully manipulated by the one they had trusted above all. Every step of the crime, every subtle misdirection, every false confession, had served a larger design, one that the butler had engineered patiently over months. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of revelation settle. The storm outside had left only stillness, yet the room felt electrified, charged with the gravity of exposure. "And so," Poirot said at last, his voice calm, measured, triumphant. "The final twist emerges. The mind that orchestrates from the shadows is often closer than we dare imagine, hidden in plain sight, shielded by routine and trust. Today, we have unveiled not one, but two minds entwined in a web of obsession and control, and justice, at last, may be properly served." The inspector stepped forward, understanding now the complexity that had eluded him until Poirot's brilliance illuminated every concealed thread. The butler, finally unmasked, allowed himself to be restrained. The household remained in stunned silence, realizing that what they had believed to be closure was only a step in a deeper, more intricate truth, revealed at last by the detective whose attention to pattern, behavior, and subtle detail had outwitted even the most calculating of minds. The drawing-room had fallen into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the dying fire and the occasional shuffle of feet as the household absorbed the full weight of the revelation. The butler, finally unmasked as the true mastermind, stood restrained by the inspector, his carefully maintained composure shattered into fragments of quiet fury and thinly veiled panic. The quiet guest, once so meticulously controlling, now trembled in relief and fear, the dual burden of her obsessive motives and her unwitting manipulation laid bare. Poirot moved slowly through the room, his eyes sweeping over each face with calm authority. "Justice," he said quietly, "is not merely the apprehension of a guilty party. It is the recognition of truth, the disentangling of lies, and the illumination of those threads that most seek to hide." In this case, there were two minds at work, entwined in secrecy and calculation. One acted from obsession, the other from patience and cunning, and together they created a labyrinth meant to confound any ordinary observer. The inspector nodded, though his expression betrayed a mixture of relief and lingering incredulity. Poirot gestured toward the scattered letters, the vanishing tonic, the paper knife, and the other subtle markers of manipulation. "Observe," he said, pointing lightly, "the clues that were overlooked or misunderstood. The letters to the B.U. Claire, detailing chemical knowledge and the timing of household habits, were present from the beginning. Only a mind attuned to human behavior, subtle pattern recognition, and the predictability of routine could connect them. Each micro-expression, each pause, each deviation from habit, the minutiae of life, was a signal, a footprint in the snow of human intent. He paused, letting the weight of his explanation settle over the room. The quiet guest believed herself to be executing a perfect design, acting independently with only her obsession guiding her. Yet she was observed, influenced, and ultimately ensnared by the true architect, the one who had trusted in the invisible power of patience and calculation. The attempt at a second crime, the vanishing evidence, all these were orchestrated to create misdirection to ensure that suspicion would fall elsewhere. But, as always, the human mind leaves traces too subtle to ignore. The butler's eyes darted nervously, a thin sheen of sweat forming at his temples, yet he remained silent, aware that any words would only confirm Poirot's deductions. The detective stepped closer, his voice softening but retaining its authority. "You see, even the smallest deviation, the choice to fidget, the micro-expression of hesitation, the alignment of objects slightly off from expectation, these reveal what we might call the invisible truth. The human element cannot be fully erased, no matter how meticulous the design." Poirot's gaze swept over the household one last time. "And so justice has been delivered, in the sense that the guilty are exposed and the web of deception unraveled. Yet one must acknowledge," he added with a faint, almost imperceptible smile, "that the criminal mind is cunning, and some who are clever may escape the immediate consequences of their actions. Here, the quiet guest's obsession has been laid bare, her role revealed. Yet it is the patient calculation of the butler that reminds us that the game is never truly finished. Vigilance is the companion of justice, and even the smallest misstep can alter the balance." The inspector tightened his grip on the butler, ensuring he could not flee. But Poirot allowed a reflective pause, letting the gravity of the moment linger. "Every clue, every gesture, every subtle trace," he said softly, "was present from the beginning. Those who did not observe closely, those who trusted appearances, missed the signals. But for those who study behavior, patterns, and the intricacies of human nature, The truth is always accessible, if one possesses patience, attention, and, of course, the little grey cells. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving a cold, clear night. Inside, the household was quiet, marked by a mix of relief, shock, and contemplation. Justice had been served, yet the lingering presence of human cunning, the awareness that some threads might remain unseen, cast a faint, unsettling shadow. Poirot, ever composed, moved to the window, his mind already reflecting on the perfection of the deduction, the subtle genius of pattern recognition, and the enduring truth that even when crime seems solved, vigilance and observation are the truest safeguards against deception. As the household slowly began to breathe again, Poirot stood quietly, a calm sentinel amidst the remnants of chaos, satisfied that the labyrinth of human deceit had been illuminated, yet mindful that human nature always leaves room for another twist, another challenge, another hidden truth waiting to emerge. Poirot stood in the doorway of the grand estate, the crisp night air brushing against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of snow and wood smoke. The household behind him was slowly settling into a subdued calm, the inspector completing formalities and the remaining staff murmuring to each other in relief and disbelief. All appeared concluded, the confessions extracted, the web of deceit unravelled, and the guilty restrained. And yet, as Poirot's sharp gaze swept over the scene one last time, he sensed a subtle disturbance, a detail that refused to fit neatly into the tidy narrative of resolution. He paused near the threshold of the driveway, glancing back at the drawing-room where the firelight had faded to embers. The quiet guest had been escorted to a room for observation, her obsessive motives and impulsive actions laid bare, and the butler was now firmly in the inspector's custody. But Poirot's mind lingered on the faint ring left on the polished surface of the mantel where the tonic had once rested, the microscopic trace of powder found beneath the rug in the pantry, and most peculiarly, the scrap of paper he had noticed earlier that no one else had questioned. Its words had seemed innocuous at first, an old shopping list perhaps, or a forgotten note, but the alignment of certain letters, the subtle ink smudge in the shape of a symbol, suggested intention. Someone, he realized, had wanted to leave a clue, or perhaps a warning. The detective smiled faintly to himself, the familiar thrill of unresolved intricacy stirring behind his eyes. "Ah, the little grey cells," he murmured under his breath. "They are never satisfied with what appears complete." His hand brushed against the leather strap of his bag, worn from years of journeys, of observations, of subtle confrontations with human cunning. Each case was a puzzle, but some puzzles, he knew, contained fragments meant to linger, to tease, to hint at the presence of mysteries yet to emerge. As he walked down the driveway, the snow crunching softly under his feet, Poirot's mind replayed the sequence of events with meticulous care. The obsessive calculations of the quiet guest, the patient manipulations of the butler, the vanishing tonic, the second attempted poisoning. It all aligned, yet one thread still pulled at his curiosity. A delivery note had been signed with an unfamiliar hand, a trace of perfume lingered faintly in a corner of the library, and in the chaos of revelations, one small box, containing powders, vials, and chemical paraphernalia, had been overlooked in the storage closet. Was it irrelevant? Perhaps. But Poirot had learned that the smallest oversight often concealed the grandest truths. He allowed himself a brief, reflective pause beneath the dark sky, the stars shimmering faintly through the dissipating clouds. "Ah, but the world," he murmured, "is never so easily concluded. For every solution, there exists another question, another shadow waiting to emerge from the folds of human intention. The faint echo of footsteps behind him, a servant carrying the last of the household belongings for inspection, reminded him that even the most settled house still contained secrets. Some dormant, some whispered in the spaces between words and gestures. Poirot adjusted his coat against the chill, his mind already tracing the potential paths of consequence. The butler's cunning, the quiet guest's compulsion, the minor misdirections that had nearly fooled even the most careful observers, all had left residual hints, faint footprints leading into an unknown horizon. Somewhere, perhaps, another mystery was forming, one that would challenge his attention, his observation, and the ever-alert precision of his reasoning. As he stepped into the carriage waiting at the end of the driveway, Poirot allowed a faint smile to curve his lips. The case at the estate was closed, yes, but the lingering trace, the overlooked detail, the cryptic little scrap, whispered insistently that his work was never truly complete. The night was quiet, the world seemingly at rest, yet Poirot knew that mysteries never truly ended. They only awaited the patient mind prepared to perceive them, to follow the invisible threads, and to reveal the truths hidden in plain sight. The carriage rolled smoothly onto the snow-dusted road, the estate shrinking behind him into the darkness. And as Poirot's eyes caught the faint glimmer of light in a distant window, a solitary glow, perhaps a signal, perhaps mere chance, he felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. A mystery, after all, was never truly over. It merely paused, ready to begin again when the subtle signs, the careful deceptions, and the patient observer aligned once more. The game of deduction never ends, and Poirot, ever vigilant, would be ready.